Hey everybody, welcome back to All Fiction is Fantasy. Daniel here. I hope you're doing well, and if you're not, I hope you are soon. Okay, today we are reviewing We Are All Legends by Darrell Schweitzer. And yeah, this is a masterpiece. This is S tier. This is one of the greatest works of sword and sorcery I have ever read. This book has ruined a lot of fantasy for me. Man, is this good. I've been really intimidated to do this video. I've tried to do this multiple times over the last 2 weeks because I think I lack the vocabulary to do this work justice. And it's making me it's making me angry. It's making me mad, because I want to just convince everybody to buy We Are All Legends, because if you want to read the very, very best that the entire genre of sword and sorcery has to offer, just start here and maybe just end here. Yeah, so this is a collection of short stories written by Darrell Schweitzer, published in 1981. The short stories were originally published individually from 1976 to 1981. The short stories are interconnected, and I think it's best to read this work as a novel. You could read a story and then put the book down, then maybe pick it up a couple weeks later and read another story. I read a lot of short story anthologies and collections like that, but I don't recommend reading this like that. I recommend reading this in the same way that you would read a novel. As a matter of fact, this work, this collection, could be turned into a novel if Schweitzer just wrote a few more little connecting passages to connect the stories. The stories are in order. The stories build to something. Taken as a whole, the collection has something to say. And man, that is definitely an understatement, let me tell you. So Schweitzer has combined the poetic and dreamlike qualities of Lord Dunsany, but with more emotional heft. He's a huge fan of Dunsany. This is definitely in the Dunsanian school of fantasy. As a matter of fact, Schweitzer has written a biography on Dunsany, and I'm looking forward to reading that. But he's combined that kind of Dunsanian poetic, dreamlike quality with the angsty kind of tragedy of Elric, but with much better prose than Moorcock. And he has combined those two elements to create one of the crowning achievements of the genre. So these stories tell the tales of Sir Julian, a knight who has returned to his home in Europe after having been slaying pagans in the Crusades. And Sir Julian is plagued with guilt. He's plagued with PTSD. He becomes disillusioned with religion. He turns his back on his God. He sells his soul to Satan and then wanders aimlessly around in a purgatorial existence, trying to find a way to die without the curse of eternal life. And that kind of just lighthearted fantasy adventure that we all enjoy. So the book is set in European Christendom, and in this setting, the biblical ideas of the Christian God and Satan are a reality. In some ways, while reading this, I was reminded of the religious fantasy Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. As a matter of fact, while I was reading it, I was kind of expecting to see illustrations from Gustave Doré from one page to the next. And while Doré's work isn't presented, I was absolutely not disappointed by the illustrations provided by Stephen Fabian. Maybe the next best thing to Doré. I love Fabian's work, and his illustrations in this book are amazing. I was also reminded of one of my favorite horror movies, and that is Jacob's Ladder. And We Are All Legends, it firmly dips its entire leg, its entire upper body into the pools of horror. There are malevolent creatures, there are demons, there are scary situations, there is violence, there is gore. And I was reminded of Jacob's Ladder, not just because of those horrific elements, but because of the way that the haunted Julian returns to a world that he once knew, but is now acutely aware of demonic forces, both external and internal. And in the final story of this collection, called Midnight, Moonlight, and the Secret of the Sea, that comparison to Jacob's Ladder becomes all the more relevant. I get the sense that this work was greatly informed by the horrors of the Vietnam War, by the horrors and the trauma of that war, and by the guilt of a surviving soldier, what they might feel like having done the things that they did in the name of king, in the name of country, and in the name of their God. However, it's not just a work of allegory. It's not just an allegory for the horrors of war. It's also a bold work of imaginative fantasy, and that's fantasy with a capital F. This book is weird. There are tidal waves made of cats, islands made of human faces, an army of murderous, disembodied, possessed hands, ice giants, witches, fairies, demons, sword fights, narrow escapes, and otherworldly locations. But all of the fantasy is made better because of the emotional grounding of Sir Julian and of the very real trauma that he is dealing with. The fantasy is made all the more harrowing because of the reality of Julian's psyche and because of that PTSD, because of that guilt that he is feeling. This is a nearly flawless, a nearly perfect collection of fantasy. If I had to come up with some nitpick, something critical to say, it would be that because all of the stories are so singularly focused on that theme, and they all kind of feel like they are of the same piece, they're woven from the same cloth, that they can feel a little samey. And while I do remember a lot of things from my read, it's hard to remember from which story those memorable things took place. So I love these kinds of characters. I love the kind of character of Sir Julian in the kinds of games that I like to play, the solo RPGs or in traditional RPGs or in fantasy board games. I will almost always, very, very often, I will play a character who is a paladin or who is a cleric who is having a crisis of faith, who hasn't lost their faith. They still believe in God, and that's the problem. They believe in God and they're pissed off at God for what they've done in the name of their God, for what God has done to their loved ones, for what God has made them do because of their faith. And Sir Julian is very much that kind of character. And man, it was so great to read a collection of short stories so well written, focusing on the kinds of characters that I absolutely love. And I kind of identify with that kind of character because of my own journey of faith in my life. And a lot of us have, a lot of us who grew up religious in kind of a Christian household or something, and throughout our lives, we turn our back on that and we move away. But it's not that we stop believing in God, but maybe we do become disillusioned. We do become angry. It's hard to divorce ourselves from that belief. And so when we see the bad things that are going on in the world, we can blame God because, hey, we still believe in God, but why is God doing this? Like what kind of God is this? What kind of God would do this? Does that kind of God deserve to be worshiped? And Sir Julian goes through all of those very, very real human emotions, those things that a lot of us go through. And to read that in such an imaginative work of fantasy, a work of fantasy that has that action, that has that adventure, that has those weird and bizarre things that we all love to be entertained by, to see those two things combined in such a strong and passionate and wonderful way is just, man, yeah, it's something, man. This book has ruined a lot of fantasy for me. I can't stop thinking about it. I know that this is going to be a work that I return to over and over again for the rest of my life. It'll probably become a yearly read because the book is only about 188 pages. You can read it in just a few days. And yeah, it's fantastic. I can't recommend it enough. Just go and buy this book. I wasn't aware of Darrell Schweitzer's presence before I read this, but come to find out, I'd already owned some stories that he had written. I know that I would recognize his name as an editor because he's been an editor on a lot of great anthologies. And he's written a ton of stuff, but his stuff has just never hit. His stuff has just never become popular with even a small audience, it seems like. It's really weird. I think this will be the only review of this book on YouTube. Once again, for some reason, I have the only review of a book on YouTube. I don't know how that happens. But I've since gone and purchased just about everything that I can from Darrell Schweitzer. A biography he wrote on Tanzania, more short story collections, a novella, a couple novels, a couple little zines that he did, a collection of nonfiction essays that he edited on Lovecraft, some comedy stuff he did, some Cthulhu-style lyrics, a book of hymns devoted to the elder gods in the style of famous hymns. So a lot of his stuff seems to have a kind of sense of humor to it. There's not a lot of humor in the Julian stories. They're pretty heavy. They're pretty hefty. They have a lot of weight. They have that burden, that burden of a person losing touch with who they thought they were and trying to come to terms with what they are going to do with the rest of their life and searching for that. And there's a song, one of my favorite Pink Floyd album is The Final Cut. I know that's weird. That's usually the album that everyone hates. It's basically a Roger Waters solo album. But I love The Final Cut. I think it is a masterpiece of progressive rock. And a lot of that has to do with the stories in the songs of what Roger Waters was going through while he was writing it. And the title track, The Final Cut, it's about Roger Waters. It's about the character of that song. I can't say it's exactly Roger Waters, but it's about him not having the nerve to make the final cut, to kill himself, because that is the end that character deserves. And there's a story in We Are All Legends where Julian knows that he needs to kill himself, but he doesn't have the courage to do it. He doesn't have the nerve to make the final cut. And man, that was really, really powerful. So, all right, guys, well, I hope you enjoyed this review. We will talk to you later. Bye-bye.